Good evening, everyone. We are 4 minutes behind schedule. Forgive me. It is all my fault. Normally you can blame the people who come late, but not this time. So we're gonna continue what we have been discussing. Has Christianity failed you? For those of you who may be joining us for the first time tonight, we've come quite a long way. For those of you who've been here all week, you've kind of noticed that we've been traversing through a lot of different things. And so arriving at the point where we are tonight is a very unique place, depending on which presentations. But I've designed the presentations so that they are kind of self-enclosed and encased. And so you don't necessarily have to come to all the presentations, although there is a thread of continuity among them. They are designed to stand alone, each presentation. And we recognize that due to the schedules of students and placing an event such as this right in the very heart of finals. I mean, you can only expect so much. So regardless of that, tonight I want to build off of what we dealt with yesterday, which is the fact that there are certain points of tension in the Christian experience, in the Christian life. We first dealt with the fact that there are intellectual points of tension, to the Christian life, and there are what we call existential points of tension to the Christian life. We dealt with the intellectual first because while those are a little easier to deal with, it is oftentimes the place where it appears as if Christianity is the weakest. That when you place it in the kind of the ballroom of ideas, Christianity seems to fall very low on the reasonability scale. So we first deal with that, but it also sets us up that when we go into the existential side of the tensions of the Christian experience, that most people will reject the intellectual tenets of Christianity because of the failure of what they experienced on the existential side. They find, as we discussed yesterday, that cognitive dissonance, that what I'm experiencing does not match what I believe, and therefore I have a choice to make. Either I need to disabuse my mind of such a belief, or I need to find a way to reinterpret my experience according to my worldview. And this led us into various categories of which God has given us innate desires within the soul of every single man. And because humanity is born, or as Christianity tends to espouse, created with certain desires, how can God blame you for these kinds of struggles becomes the question. So now, the fulcrum of all of these different things turn on the very idea that there is something beyond what we can experience through our senses. Please follow me. You see, when we talk about sexuality, yesterday we talked about the very fact that sexuality is not about sex, but that there is something beyond sex that gives the sexual act any kind of meaning or significance. It is pointing to a reality beyond itself. Now, in grappling with that very idea, we must assume there is something beyond in order to give it significance at all. Now, this is so essential to understanding that the heritage of atheism, if we are going to reject the intellectual Christian worldview, as we said, we have to answer 4 basic questions. Every single worldview: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Every single worldview has to answer those questions. Every single one. And so now, with the new atheism that has now arrived on the scenes with a certain stridency and a commitment to a naturalistic worldview, the ideas now are out there and say, look, we are now on a crusade to destroy faith in God. That theism has become beyond the opiate of the masses. It is the great disillusionment of society. It cannot be denied that the majority of the world espouses atheistic worldview, but that does not make it true. As your parents might tell you, if you come home and they say, why did you ever do this? And you say, well, the other children were doing it. And then your mother will say, so if they jump off a bridge, will you also jump off a bridge? So the new atheism says, just because the majority of people are espousing atheistic worldview does not make it true, nor does it make it the best decision, nor does it make it correspond to reality. So majority is not that which we can depend upon to arrive at an idea of truth. So now, the question then becomes, what is the answer that atheism provides to these four questions? Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Atheism has to provide an answer to. Not just that they can bash and drill at the Christian worldview, but the very fact that if you take it out of the picture, what is left? What becomes the heritage of atheism? So now, first of all, let's break down the concept of atheism. Atheism is a juxtaposition of two Greek words, alpha and theos, right? The alpha is what we call in Greek the negative particle, right? And theos obviously means God, or some sort of transcendent being. So when a person says, I am atheist, they are doing the absolute negation. There is no God. They are not what we call agnostic, which agnostic, again, the alpha, the negative, with the Greek word gnosis, or coming from the actual Greek word gnosko, which means to know by experience. So now, the agnostic is, yes, we don't know whether there is a God. That's agnosticism. Now, when most people enter into intellectual debates, if someone asked me, they said, so, would you be willing to debate someone on the issue of atheism? And I said, well, first of all, I hope the person is not taking the position of atheism. Why not? Well, because when you say atheism, you're saying there's absolutely nowhere in the known or unknown universe, there absolutely is no God. And two things confront the atheist immediately. Number one, you cannot prove the non-existence of something. Just as I cannot prove to you that I did not go to this school. You say, how would you prove that? You can't prove something that does not exist. Oh, I'm going to show you it doesn't really exist. What are you really saying? It's a meaningless concept. Number two, in order for you to claim there is no God, you'd have to be the very thing you are denying. Because what you are saying is there is no God anywhere in the universe. Is that correct? So the question is, if you travel at the speed of light to the galaxy of Andromeda, could it be that while you were traveling to Andromeda, God decided to stop by in the Milky Way galaxy? Very possible. So you wonder why you didn't find him in Andromeda, because he stopped by here in the Milky Way galaxy. And then as you took a million, billion years to travel light years into other distant stars, you find that by the time you traverse the universe, you'll probably die first, assuming that you could live for millions and millions of years. To traverse the whole universe, you have to be every single place at every single moment in time in order to know there is no God. And therefore, atheistic posture is self-defeating. It is incoherent intellectually. So the concept that people say, I am an atheist, they are claiming the very thing they are denying. I have to be it in order to know that this is true. So now most people who have a little bit of brains and a little bit of philosophical training, they shift over to this one as if this is like, you know, I'm out of the hot seat. No. You just went from the pot to the kettle, right? The kettle to the pot, whatever the saying goes. Agnosticism. So let's just say you're like, all right, atheism, I can't handle that one. So I'll become agnostic. I will say we can't know whether there is a God or not. And then immediately it becomes self-defeating again. You say, absolutely, we cannot know there is a God? Yeah, we cannot know. How do you know? So when people raise the question of, I am an agnostic, I don't know, we cannot know, negative, there is no way to gain knowledge by experience that there is a God. How do you know that? I know that because, what? Because you have knowledge. And in order, again, for you to say justifiably, I do not know there is a God, we cannot know there is a God, you have to be the very thing that you are denying. You have to have all knowledge in order to know that you cannot know. In the words of one preacher, when he was there visiting, he said, when an atheist audience said, look, how do we know there is a God? How can we know, and how do we know it's even possible for us to know? And through a stroke of brilliance, he said, here you are in, I believe he was in maybe Ukraine. He says, as you're in the Ukraine, the question now comes up to say, you guys are here at the university, so out of the 100%, let's say this is all the knowledge that there is to be gained in the entire world, just the planet Earth. This is all the knowledge that there is to be gained on the planet Earth. Out of this amount, let's just say this is a pie, what percentage of that knowledge do you believe you possess? 10%? Now we're talking about every culture, every book ever written, in every different language. Yes, there's 2,200 of them known. Although there's 6,500 languages that they are now discovering. But 90% of the world speaks 2,200 different languages. So out of all those languages, do you have all that knowledge? You know all those languages from all those different places. Of that percentage of knowledge there is to be gained in the world, just the earth, what percentage do you have? 10%? 20%? The professors are sitting there in the audience, they're like, and they look at their students, they're like, maybe 5%. So out of all the knowledge there is to be gained in the world, you're saying you only have 5% of the knowledge. Yes. So could it be that in the other 95% is the information needed to come to an understanding that there is a God? Well, you have to say yes, because you don't know. Agnosticism does not work either. You can't say you don't know, or that you cannot know. You can say you don't know, you can't say you can know. Now, to build further on this, we're talking about the heritage of atheism. This strident atheism, as we already just talked about, philosophically it is untenable to hold as a position. But we do have to deal with the fact that there is an atheism that is amidst and afoot. And the question becomes, what is the heritage of that? And is it reasonable to have faith? That is the question we seek to answer. Because there are certain things, the Bible says that spiritual things are spiritually discerned. So in other words, things that are non-physical by definition. If it is spiritual, it is non-physical. So things that are non-physical. And before we get to the naturalistic worldview, we're going to go there. Things that are non-physical, how do you discern those things? You say there is a God, but God is a spirit, according to John chapter 4. Now, if God is a spirit, he is non-physical. How do I discern things that are non-physical or spiritual? And the Bible says you can only discern them spiritually. That's the only way to discern them. That's the only way to perceive them. That's the only way to see them. So the question then becomes, does that translate intellectually, philosophically? That's the question that we're seeking to answer tonight. Is there philosophically, intellectually room for faith as a means of knowledge and understanding? That is the question. And the heritage of atheism, as soon as you get rid of God, you're saying there is nothing transcendent. There's nothing outside of the material world. This is what has led to what we call naturalism. Naturalism, coming from the Latin natura, and obviously we have the word natural, is that when we talk about the word natural, we're dealing with a very interesting concept. Essentially, natural, for example, right, we can say we like to go spend time in nature in a natural environment. We talk about the very idea that, he is just a natural at this particular gift or sport, or he's a natural at this instrument of music. We also say things like either those are your natural teeth or your unnatural teeth. Or we say, hey, when you're going to, meet your girlfriend's father for the very first time, you say, look, just act natural. And all these different statements in the usage of the word natural, we're simply arguing for that which comes of its own self. You see, when you say the man is a natural at playing the flute, what you're saying is, without lessons, without the instruction of a flautist who is very gifted and talented, he just seems to pick it up on his own. It comes of his own self. There is nothing outside of him that taught him to do these things. So when we talk about, are those your natural teeth? Those are the teeth that come of your own body. No one put them in. There was no dentistry. There was no hygienist. There was no one who was making your teeth in a laboratory somewhere, making sure it fit perfectly within. Those would be unnatural. And so in the argument of C.S. Lewis, the issue is not creation versus evolution. The issue is supernaturalism versus naturalism. The fundamental issue is the rejection of miracles. That there is nothing that does not come of its own self. What is in nature is in nature. Hence the idea of evolution, it produced its own self. It is from this primordial mass that all of a sudden this primordial mass eventually ended up at people like me giving lectures. I'm the result of time plus chance plus matter. That's why we're here right now. And all these ideas then, why am I saying the things that I'm saying? Well, because if you follow the naturalist worldview, there's nothing outside of me that put these things in my mind. It came of its own self. Then what you are saying is, there is no free will. There is only determinism. You and I are dancing to our DNA. That's what we do. You cannot be anything else other than what is in you, because nothing is external to you. There is nothing transcendent. And if you go with the agnostic view, there may be something transcendent, but we will never know what it is and never understand it, which puts us in a whole different category of problems. Now, if we move to the fact that there is no free will and there's sheer determinism, how then, if you're talking about origin, naturalism, it comes of its own self. Then you're talking about meaning, there is nothing beyond you to give your life any significance. Then you go to morality. If I'm just dancing to my DNA, why is it that what Hitler did was wrong? He was just doing what comes of his own self. He was determined to do what he did. Pol Pot was determined to do what he did in Cambodia. These people were determined by their DNA. But if we're going to have moral responsibility, we must have free will. And somehow this seems to elude people who think, oh, I got you Christians. How do you reconcile a loving God with the problem of evil? And yet the problem of evil is always raised by a person or about a person. And the outrage is only based on the fact that he or she could have chosen to do something else. Otherwise, why do we have a legal system? Why do we put people in prison? Why do we say you are innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Everything in the jury was determined. They were determined to convict you. Whether you're innocent or not, they're just dancing to their DNA. So why do we put people down? If they're just determined. You see, this inheritance that we receive from atheism, the issue of morality becomes a huge problem. And there was a recent atheist blogger. Her name is Leah. And she shocked the secular community when she converted to theism. This is recently, last year. And she said she was convinced by the moral argument. She says, how do you establish morality if you get rid of God and you're only left with scientific naturalism? How can I tell Hitler what he did was wrong if he's just dancing to his DNA? And those people who are dead, there is no justice. What do I tell my grandmother when they broke into her house, robbed her, and beat her to death? There is no hope, there is no reconciliation, no intervention in this life because there is no one to intervene, and there will be righting no wrongs in an afterlife either. So if atheism robs Christianity from the world, we arrive at that same point to say, how then do you comfort people? What do you tell them? It was shocking to me, my wife was telling me that in one of her classes, she's taking marriage and family therapy. And at the end of the class, the instructor was like, today our topic is the issue of death. And he said, what do you guys think, right? These are marriage and family counselors, soon to be in your homes, right? Coming to a family near you. And these people were asked the question, how do you comfort people in death? What words of consolation and hope can you provide? And the class was silent. If there's anything people need counseling and hope about, it's death. What do you say to the child whose father does not wake up? How do you comfort them? Do you just say, hey, Timmy, your dad is just random qualifications of atoms. He will never ever exist ever again. That's just the way things are. You just need to accept it. And one day you will die too. We're all breathing to death. It's just life. But have a good afternoon. My condolences. What are you going to tell him? So in this, atheism leaves you with these 4 questions, basically saying, we're bankrupt. Where do you come from? Naturalism. You come from nothing. Time plus chance plus matter. So then where's the meaning? There is no meaning. Well, if there's nothing transcendent, and we didn't come from anything personal, and there is no transcendent, we're all just coming of our own selves. We're the result of nature. We are what we were made to be. We just dance to our DNA. How do we establish morality? We can't do that. And then when people do commit evil, and sometimes people die, we have no consolation for you. Death is the end. That's it. But atheists will say, yes, you look at this picture, it is a gloomy picture. Atheists will not deny that. But they say it's not a fairy tale. They say, look, just because it's comforting doesn't mean I need to accept it as true. And so the question of the atheist then becomes is, where do you find intellectual room for faith? That's the question the atheist asks. And so tonight I want to build upon this through the PowerPoint, because if I try to do this on the board, you will get lost in the sauce. And so as a result of that, I decided to use this PowerPoint. Now, is faith reasonable? Let's go through this. So there was a woman by the name of Annie J. Flint. She was born in 1866 on Christmas Eve. Her mother died when she was 3 years old. An unwanted burden upon her stepmother, because her dad remarried and was basically like, I didn't want this child and I have no interest in taking care of her. Her and her sister, Annie's younger sister, they were not welcome. Eventually, they were adopted into a Baptist family who loved them very much. And this was the introduction of Annie to her faith in God. But at some point in time, she developed rheumatoid arthritis to the point that she could not walk. You see the picture here, she's wheelchair bound. She died at a very young age. Eventually, she needed to be cared for, but the problem was she had to do it at her own expense. There's no Obamacare back in those days. Thus, she began writing poems and Christmas carols to pay for her medical expenses. Each month, it seemed as if her disease was getting worse and worse and worse, and eventually, she got so bad that she herself could not write the Christmas songs and the hymns and the carols that she was producing in order to pay for herself. And so she had to have someone write them for her. And the interesting thing is, her last words, when she was about to die, and the doctor said, I don't think you're going to survive this one. Is there anybody you want me to call, or is there anything you want me to say on your behalf? And these were Annie's last words. She says, I have nothing to say. It's all right. It's interesting. I want to share with you one of the poems that she wrote that clearly, for a woman who was constantly in pain day in and day out. And these are the words that she wrote. She said, He giveth more grace as our burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength as our labors increase. To added afflictions he addeth his mercy. To multiply trials he multiplies peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving is only begun. His love has no limits, his grace has no measure, his power no boundary known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again. Do those sound like the words of a woman who is in pain the majority of her life? Sound like a woman who is discouraged by her condition? The question becomes, this faith inspired Annie Flint through so much pain. Is it real? Or is she living in an illusion? Or is it, as others have said, faith is just the opiate of the masses? Are you guys able to see the screen?
The smaller ones.
The smaller ones? Okay. Check the lights. Now, let's talk about the concept of worlds of faith. Traditions of faith believe that there is more to reality than what our senses can tell us. This is a very important point. The traditions of faith say, yes, you have touch, you have smell, you have hearing, sight, taste, but there's more to the world than what you are able to perceive through your senses. And so worlds of faith have typically believed, one, yes, there is the physical world, which we experience through our five senses. But secondly, there is also a spiritual world behind this world, which is timeless. See, the belief of faith and of people who believe in God is not that we ignore the physical world, but that there is a reality behind the physical world. That even in the annals of human history and through the course of human events, there is play and interplay of spiritual beings behind the scenes. Principles that are afoot among the movements of the earth. And so these worlds of faith, as they claim this, is this claim a reasonable claim? Can we rationally sustain this idea? Now, there is a gentleman by the name of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is actually not a believer in God. He was not necessarily a man of faith. But he had presented a radical idea. And before Kant, many believed that there was only one limit to what human beings could know. There's only one limit to what human beings could know, and they said that is reality itself. You cannot know more than what actually exists. Now that would seem reasonable. But Kant, as a response to a man named David Hume and his skepticism, and I don't have time to go through that, but maybe in the Q&A time we can explore this. Kant believed that there was an even greater limitation to human reason and experience. And this is what he said. He said, all human knowledge is based on experience. This is his first premise. I want you to follow his thinking. Everything that we know is based on our experience. We heard someone say it, we felt it, we smelled it, we tasted it, we saw it. But this is how. If you remove all the senses from a newborn baby, how can the baby learn anything? Becomes the question. Now, we gain access to reality, according to Kant, through our five senses. Now, this information is then processed through our brains, and we deduce certain things about the world. This is black, this is hard, this is soft, she's tall, he's short, whatever the case may be. Now, how do we know, was the question that Kant asked. How do we know that our perceptions of reality correspond to reality itself? That was the question he asked. And this is the reason why he asked the question. David Hume was angry with scientists. And he says, the reason why I'm angry with scientists is because scientists will come and say, well, we dropped this apple 1,000 times and it has always fallen. And therefore there's this law that we call gravity. And David Hume says, this is foolishness. There is nowhere in the world of mathematics and reason that a person can measure something, a finite number of observations can predict an infinite number of possibilities. You cannot say because, oh, Sebastien wears a red sweater this Friday, today, that he will always wear a red sweater. You would say that is unreasonable for you to conclude. This is what we call in reasoning an inductive argument. It is probable, but it is not a law. It is probable, but it is not a law. In fact, this is how the weather works. Permit me to digress for a minute. When you go to yahoo.com or theweatherchannel.com, and they say the weather today will be 54 degrees, partly cloudy, light rain. The question when you see that is, where do they get this information from? And permit me to let you in on a little secret. Meteorologists, what they do is they say, we have a finite amount of information on the weather. And what they do is they track this data and they say, whenever the conditions, the temperature, pressure, whatever have been these specific numbers, 60% of the time it has rained. So now they will tell you when you turn it on and say, oh, 60% chance of rain. But you ever had one of those days where you looked at the weather and it said 100% chance of rain? And then you walked outside and it never rained? Or maybe it said 0% chance of rain and you walked outside into a monsoon. Maybe that one's a little more painful and therefore you remember that. You were out there with your summer dress only to discover it was about to be a monsoon today. And you will be frustrated because you'll say, forget the iPhone, forget the weatherchannel.com. They told me it was 0% chance of rain. You know why? Because they're saying, of all the times these figures have been the case, it has never rained. That doesn't mean it won't rain today. That's Hume's point. And Kant took that idea and he said, that means our observations of reality are not always true. In science, which boasts of the scientific method, we observe phenomena, we create a hypothesis about that phenomena, then we test it and isolate certain variables, and then we make observations based on the test and say, oh, my hypothesis was correct or non-correct. And Kant says, how do you know what your observation is actually what's reality? How can you trust your perceptive abilities? You cannot. So as a result of this, Kant developed this idea. He says there are two types of information or being, I guess you can call it. First of all, you have what he calls the noumena, right? This is something in itself. I will give an example just to make it a little more accessible. And secondly, he has what's called the phenomena, right? This is our experience of the thing itself. Now, just keep tracking with me on this. So Kant argues, right? the noumena is what we cannot know. We cannot know a thing of its own self, but we can, he says, phenomena is what we can know. Explain. So here you have a little puppy, and the noumena is the dog itself. But the phenomena is our experience of the dog. He feels furry, he's warm, he smells a certain way, whatever the case may be. He says, when you think of your dog, for those of you that have pets or whatever, gerbils or, rattlesnakes, whatever you have at home, you have a memory of your sensory experience with the pet. But Kant's point is this. We will never know what it is like to be a dog. There is a difference. You can experience a dog, but you'll never know what it's like to actually be a dog. So, in what he's basically saying is this, is that you may see the dog and say his fur is soft, but the question is, does it feel soft to the dog? You can never know, because you're not a dog. To translate that into real time, when you see that girl walking on the little runway and you say, oh, this is Louis Vuitton. She looks really nice and confident and comfortable. You don't know if she really is confident and comfortable and nice inside. Your perceptions say, oh, wow. And then we run to the store and we all buy her 5-inch heels and her dress and then discover it is actually very uncomfortable. And I feel very unconfident as I'm walking in these 5-inch heels. Afraid that I'm going to trip over an uneven sidewalk slab somewhere in the university, but of course, where? In the dyad when everybody is passing by. This very idea of noumena, he says, you can never know what it's like to be a dog. And Kant says, I think I have created room for faith. I say, why? Because thus we can never compare our experience of reality to reality itself. How do you know that what we are experiencing from God is actually what God is like? There was a woman who was sharing about the death of her husband. Her son was 1 year old, and her husband had gone for a run, and he said, I'm going to cool off and I'm going to take a swim in the pool. And while she was doing laundry, she saw her son going crazy at the window, looking at the dad down at the swimming pool. And then finally she looked and she said, what is he looking at? And she saw a whole bunch of people around the pool. And her son had gone down with him, with the dad, and he had come back up. And he had told her, Daddy, he won't come up. He won't come up. So she followed her son down to the pool. She says, why is he doing this? He left this poor child all by himself. And then you see everyone there around the pool, and that was her husband. Floating, not swimming. He was dead. And she said, as my parents and everything were, coming to visit, and they had left, and, everyone had given their condolences, she said, I was just praying and crying over my whole situation, so discouraged. Why would God allow this to happen? And she says, I started reading in the Bible and God says, I will be your husband. I will be faithful to you. I will take care of you. I will redeem you. All these things. And she says, I started praying and she said, Lord, I know this is what you're saying, but this is not how I feel. And she says, I don't know what it was, but she says, I just felt like someone just started holding me as I was praying. It just felt like somebody just put their arms around me. And she said, I just felt as if God was saying to me, it's going to be all right. And the question is, was her experience corresponding to reality? Does God wrap his arms around suffering people? Does he comfort the afflicted? Is he really merciful? And Kant says, we have a place where there is a limitation of our experience and our ability to compare that to reality itself. And so, as he says he had made room for faith, Kant began to articulate what the Bible already told us in the book of Hebrews chapter 11. In verse 3, where the Apostle Paul is writing and he says, through faith we understand that the worlds were not framed of the things which are seen, but of the things which are not seen. Say, wait a minute. And then he starts the chapter by making this very enigmatic statement about faith. He says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things what? Not seen. Faith is. And so when our experience, my senses, cannot explain this phenomenon, this thing that I'm experiencing, the Bible says faith can know what your senses can never grasp. You can know it by faith. And so this idea that Kant says, look, I think I made room for faith because guess what? There's some things I cannot know by reason, by observation, by smell, by touch, by hearing and by sight. I cannot know them. There is a limitation to my knowledge. And therefore this sense of faith, the evidence of things not seen, it is the only way for me to understand that the worlds were framed not by the things which are seen, but the things that are not seen. Let me quickly rush to my conclusion and now open it up for questions. I end with the words of a man named Blaise Pascal. He was a French mathematician, a very reluctant convert, as he calls himself in his book, Pensies. And he had borrowed an idea from an Islamic theologian, Abu Hamid al-Ghazi. And Muslims are very known for their mathematical, this is actually where we get the word algebra from. It's actually from a Muslim word, just in case you may not have known that. But anyway, so Pascal developed something that he calls Pascal's wager. And this is what he says. He says, in life, we have to gamble. And most people think they're not gambling in life, but they're really gambling. And this is why. Pascal says, first of all, if you consider a new job opportunity, they say, hey, we want to promote you, but you're going to have to move out to Alaska. And when you go to Alaska, it's a beautiful place. They offer you great pay, all these different things. So here's this new job opportunity. And Pascal says, how do you know it's going to be better? How do you know that it's actually going to be what they tell you it's going to be? How many people have been hired for a job and they say, oh yeah, you'll totally have the liberty to do this and the freedom to do that, and we provide this, and we're a very good, close camaraderie group, only to discover when you actually accept a job and step into the position, it is exactly the opposite of what they told you. The very point is, you were gambling. And gambling is when you are making a decision based on limited information. When you should be checking E, not enough information, insufficient data. But you say, look, you have to make a choice. Or when you have a possible love interest. I love sharing this thing when presenting on relationships because all over the world, everybody wants to know, how do I know she is the one? How do I know he is the one? I'm like, listen, you're gambling. For all you know, that girl could be crazy, out of her mind. For all you know, this guy is a crazy stalker. He's been waiting for you for 10 years. For all you know. And the people are like, yeah, but how can I know? How can I know? And I say, look, that which you cannot perceive by your senses, you can only perceive by faith. Every relationship is by faith. Anybody can look nice and be nice for 2 weeks. For 2 hours on a date at Olive Garden. That's not too difficult. People do that on Broadway all the time. So this very idea that when we express a love interest, yeah, I think this is the girl, I think this is the guy, we are gambling. We don't want to say that, but that is what we are doing. And for all you know, it's about to ruin your life. But people still go forward, Pascal says. Why? And this is what he says. He says information is inadequate. You don't have enough time. When your job says, hey, we have a new position for you, and you're like, well, give me about 5 months to think about it. No. We don't have 5 months for you to do research, visit Alaska, get a sense of the climate and the group. No, we don't have time for that. Or you go to a girl and it's like, well, I have this relationship interest, and she's like, so what is this thing that we are in? Are we dating? Are we together? Well, give me about 8 months to just kind of meditate on this thing, get to know your family. I want to come visit, but not official, like we're not together. People are like, look, you can't have a girl waiting forever. And there's the risk that if you wait too long, you lose. And so Pascal says we also gamble because we have to make a decision. And whether it be a new job opportunity or whether it be a relationship, not making a decision is making a decision. If there's anything a woman hates, it is indecisiveness. And so as a result, we have to make a choice. We have to make a choice, Pascal says. So he goes forward and he says this. The same is the case with God. The same is the case with God. Why? Because experience and reason are inadequate for us to determine whether God exists or not. I've already said this earlier in the week, but I will say it again. Just because people discover Australopithecus afarensis in some broke down ice in a godforsaken place in Antarctica does not mean God does not exist. But it's funny how people make these logical leaps. Aha! I found the missing link in the evolutionary ladder. God is non-existent. We all came into being by evolution. No. Experience and reason cannot tell you he does not exist. It can tell you there are some bones in the ice. People used to live around here somewhere. That's what that tells you. That doesn't tell you there is no God. On the flip side, just because you felt something when you were on your knees praying, or you decided, hey, I was up last night and I felt like God was just speaking to me. For all we know, you had too many root beers, or you were at the pizza house a little too late. You need to just slow down on the calculus homework. You could just be tripping. Just to say that, for basic terms. For us, basic folk. But the problem with God is we have to make a decision. Because the Christian worldview says, if it is true, there will be a day of judgment, and death will come by every man. The Grim Reaper is not like the mailman. He doesn't forget houses sometimes. He never puts it in the wrong box. And because we all have to face death, and we don't know when death is coming, we are forced to make a decision on inadequate information and experience. And so Pascal says, death forces us to choose. There's a reason why many people who are stridently, vehemently, staunchly against God, when they are dying, all of a sudden find faith in God. It was funny because, Stephen Dawkins, he's this guy at Oxford, the God Delusion, and he's talking all this stuff about how religion is all fairy tales. And he actually got caught on an interview on a radio station. And Stephen Dawkins was on his radio station. He says, many Christians, they don't even know the actual title of the first book of the Bible. And the man that he was talking to, he said, so, Stephen, I have a question for you. Do you know the actual full, complete, original title for Darwin's first seminal work, The Origin of Species? And as he paused on live radio, he's thinking, he's like, and you know what he said? Here is the new atheist, God Delusion. He said, oh my God, what is the title? This is a man who has dedicated his life to ridding himself of God, and he says, well, I'm going to depend upon God to figure out the first seminal work on evolution. Even in this moment, it's just ironic to me. But anyway, in moments of great challenge, God seems to emerge quite largely. So now, Pascal says this. What if I believe in God and I am wrong? I gamble on the side of faith. He says, first of all, you lose nothing. Why do you lose nothing? Well, people would always argue statistically, existentially, and empirically, just the tenets of the Christian life are a better life. They have happier, all kinds of things. I don't need to go into all of that right now. Secondly, he says, I simply did not understand the reality that was not there. So, okay, there was something I thought was there, but I ended up being wrong. And the issue is, death is it, and I will never know that I made a mistake. Once I die, that's it. It's over. You died. There is no God. There's no afterlife. Pascal says, what did you lose? What did you lose? You won't even know that you lost the bet in reality. But then he says, but what if I do not believe and I am wrong? First of all, Pascal says you lose everything. You've lost eternity in exchange for a finite choice of life that you can live however you wanted. Yeah, you could go out and be hedonistic, promiscuous, whatever you wanted to do for 60 years, 80 years, and 10, only to discover you lost infinite bliss for infinite time in exchange. Any man at a gambling casino would tell you that is a foolish bet. And so as a result, he says, I failed to accept the reality and realize my life was actually one big deception. And I will live to know it. On the day of the judgment, I will know that my life was one big deception. I betted wrongly, and I will be confronted with the riches that I lost. And death is it, but I will know. I will know by experience what I have lost. I will see it with my own eyes. The glory of the saints, the New Jerusalem, I will have beheld. That which is most precious, and yet know that I can never have it. Thus, to not believe is to bear greater risk and loss. And in the face of an uncertain outcome, this is Pascal's conclusion, no rational person would refuse to give up something that is finite if there is the possibility of gaining an infinite prize. No rational person would do that. And so the atheist responds, he says, well, I will simply bear the brave, I will be the brave and lonely man who will face the abyss of my destruction. You'd be surprised. I've met people who say these things. But let me conclude with the lion illustration. Imagine you're placed in a room. And as you're in the room, you realize there is something moving in this room. You don't know how big it is. And you realize it is a group of lions. Now, as you're in this, you're thinking to yourself, okay, if it were just one lion, maybe I could somehow fight my way, through this or survive. But when you realize there are umpteen lions in this room, you are immediately confronted with the reality, even if I take out 3 lions, there's another 12 that are hungry. And then a person comes to you and says, hey, look, as they come and they tell you, hey, listen, if you try this door, you can get out. Now, the reality is you could go to the door and it could be locked and it not work. That's a possibility. Or you could go to the door and it could open and you're saved. And for a person to say, in that situation, you know what? I think that door might be unlocked. No, forget it. It's not even worth trying. I won't even try the door. A person will look at you and say, you're foolish. If you try the door and it doesn't open, you are going to die anyway. But if you try the door, and like they say, those people of faith, they found a way out, then you have gained life. So why would a person not try the door? And so I believe the heritage of atheism is not a brave and lonely man willing to brave the reality of life for what it really is. But it is really a prideful and arrogant man who is not willing to try the door. and find out, does it really open to life? That's the heritage of ignorance. And it makes me wonder, are people really afraid of what they don't know? Or is it, as it may appear to be sometimes, I don't want there to be a God, so that I can free me to do what I want to do? Any questions?
And that we're using it as a crutch.
Yes.
It basically calls it laziness. To say that these things are supernatural, the things we don't know, instead of saying that one day we may have the capability of understanding these things, specifically with miracles.
I see. So, yeah, this is the common scientist argument that believing in God and using that to answer some of the scientific questions of life hinders development and the exploration of knowledge. And to say this, number one, it is historically untrue. Because all the people that have advanced science upon whose shoulders that Stephen Hawking stands were all men of faith. That the Enlightenment was precipitated off the belief that the world is supposed to make sense. That purpose precedes existence. That there was intentionality and design placed in the world by some being of greater intelligence. You would never look at, if I told you, right, Webster or Oxford American Dictionary, you say, hey, how did you get this dictionary? A bomb exploded in a room of typewriters and gave us a dictionary. You would say, that is ridiculous. And yet, when you look at DNA, 3.1 billion bits of information, and you'll look at that and say, oh yeah, that just kind of happened. So Isaac Newton said, which is funny because Stephen Hawking takes the chair of physics at Oxford, which is the distinguished chair of Isaac Newton, and he sits in that very same seat in department and tries to tear down the very reasons that motivated Newton to even make this inquiry. So historically, it is untrue. Copernicus, Galileo, all these people assume that because there is a God, the world is designed to make sense. And thus Newton said, I'm just trying to think God's thoughts after him. But if you take a naturalistic view of the world, how do you justify the assumption that the world does make sense at all? That's the question that I've still never heard an answer. So you're like, yeah, you guys just use God to fill in the gaps. Well, that's a problem because you're built on the shoulders of institutions such as Christianity that have always advanced thought, that have prompted inquiry, not to replace God, but to appreciate the beauty of what He has done. And so historically, faith and science have not had a relationship of tension. That was actually a very new concept that came up in the late 1800s and has somehow persisted to today. But most people that we look up to, with the theories that we have now come to accept were not produced by atheistic scientists. They were produced by Christian scientists. And I don't mean that in a religious sense. So when they say that, that's my response. Yes?
Just thinking, you beautifully touched like one of the biggest failures of atheism is that it can never account for knowledge.
Yes.
Atheism can never account for knowledge based on the
correct
philosophies of atheism. But I have two questions. One is the point you mentioned about free will, like both from the perspective of Christianity and the other perspective. Do we, like, just from that perspective, do we really have free will? Because I'm just thinking about it, like the Bible says, like, Christians, when we follow Christ, our will is under God. And if we're not, our will is under the enemy. So that means one way or another, we don't have free will, but we have free choice. So my question is, like, is there a difference between free will, like, do we really have free will in that sense? Or is it just, or do we have free choice, like we can choose. Like, and my second question is regarding Pascal's wager. From the way I look at it, like I've been reading about this, the past couple of months. Too often we use it as a means of apologetics or as a means of debating these non-Christians. But then isn't Pascal's wager just a necessary pragmatic decision that we have to make, because it really doesn't have anything to do with faith. Like Pascal, from my understanding of what he presented, is saying, oh, you're just, kind of betting over here, so you might, as well bet, and if you win, you'll win. If you lose, you're never going to know.
Yes.
Nothing's going to come. So where is the... I feel like his argument really fails from the perspective of faith as it is in the Bible, because all he's saying is like, hey, you might as well bet on this side.
I see.
Might as well bet on the beautiful girl in class.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, going back to your first question, the issue of free will, free choice, do we really have free will because of the sovereignty of God? On both sides, whether we are followers of God, whether we are not followers of God.
On the other side, we're following the devil.
Yes.
We're following the enemy, so we still don't have free choice, free will.
I see what you're saying. So essentially you're saying that we're following the enemy in terms of whether we're under God, we're choosing to give our will to God. But if we're not choosing to give our will to God, we will be under the control of Satan.
Yeah.
Okay, that is a, first of all, there's 2 points that need to be unpacked. First of all, there's a theological question. Because we are naturally have a bent towards evil, right? That's an inherited natural tendency, according to the theological construct in the Bible. We are born with a propensity to go with these suggestions of the devil. The Apostle Paul argues in the book of Romans, is not that we don't have free will, is that our free will is subjected to our sinful nature. So what happens is, Martin Luther grappled with this thing to say, how do we say that it's righteousness by faith and we merit nothing, even in choosing Christ? But at the same token, he used the illustration of, well, we're basically like a horse and it depends on who the rider is. So either my will is being ridden by the devil or my will is being ridden by God. But Calvin took Luther's ideas to the next level and said, well then, there is no free will. It is the sovereignty of God. He decides who the devil gets to ride in terms of his will, and who God gets to. But then a man named John Wesley appeared. And in Methodism, he introduced a concept called prevenient grace, which tried to preserve the free will of man and yet the sovereignty of God at the same time. And this theological point is what set the discussion completely differently in a different trajectory going forward. Prevenient grace says you have free will, but you are born a slave to sin. Your will needs to be freed. And so when the gospel is presented to a man or to a woman, the Holy Spirit, this prevenient grace, comes down and frees your will, and you have a choice this time. Now your will is no longer bound under sin. You can choose to either continue to be a slave of sin, or you can choose to be a servant of Christ. And so there is a certain level of the fact that we do not have supreme will, but we have free will. Meaning this: we cannot choose to say Jesus will not come back. Some people say, I can't keep Jesus from coming back. That means I don't have free will. I can't keep Jesus from punishing me. Well, you also can't keep the state of Michigan from giving you a ticket for speeding. Does that mean you don't have free will? No, the free will is you chose to speed. There is a government with which you are accountable to for the use of that freedom. And therefore, freedom can only truly be preserved by virtue. So when people talk about, do I have a choice, do I not? No, the sovereignty of God does not violate man's will when it comes to his choice of allegiance and whom he will give his affections to.
But the redemption of man was given so that this prevenient grace could liberate his will and give him the freedom to choose who his master would be. And so in the words of C.S. Lewis, hell is a place that is locked on the inside. Every person who goes to hell is going because they want to. Not because God forced them, or because the devil dragged them there. It will be their own choice. God punishes no man for that which he did not exercise his freedom to eat. That's the biblical worldview in terms of freedom. So yes, we have semi-transcendence, we do not have complete transcendence. And therefore there are things we cannot change, but that does not mean we do not have freedom. That's how we reconcile with theology in the Bible. According to your second question about Pascal's wager in terms of faith, it is true that Pascal is arguing from a pragmatic perspective. That is exactly what he's arguing. And the reason why Pascal is taking that perspective is he's saying people claim that following God is an irrational decision. So Pascal is simply trying to argue for the fact and say, look, it is not an irrational decision. It is actually a completely rational decision. It is unbelief that does not have the rational basis for itself. So as a result of that, when we say, well, Pascal is just giving us a practical, we all have to gamble, we have to make a choice, so gamble on this side. Pascal's point is, if your issue is rationalism, and to be a rational person, then you should choose faith. Just based on the gambling model. But this does not negate the need for sincerity in religion. Because Christ speaks abundantly to those who are obsessed with reward. And he gives a parable about this in the parables of the laborers in the vineyard. And the one who comes with the spirit of a hireling, I chose faith, therefore God should reward me with eternal riches and all these different things. We forget that salvation is about knowing God. This is life eternal, Jesus said, that they might know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom thou hast sent. There will be no one in heaven who does not know God. And therefore, just betting pragmatically gets you past the rational objection that is made. But surely there is much work to be done, even after you persuade a person through Pascal's wager. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. But I believe Pascal is just responding to the claim that it's irrational to have faith in God, to trust in that which you do not know, and you have inadequate information. Great questions. Any other questions? Yes?
You said earlier that evil is people choosing to do something else, right?
You said evil is people choosing to do something else?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Earlier?
Go on.
Okay, no, so I was wondering about like natural disasters. That's not people really choosing to do. People don't choose to create a natural disaster.
Yes. Okay, so you're talking about the question of what we call natural evil. That's what it's typically called, right? So storms, Hurricane Sandy, these things, tornadoes, right? And these other phenomena that we call natural phenomena, storms. And your question, I'm assuming, is what is the theistic response to those occurrences? First of all, the book of Job does articulate the fact that based on a heavenly discussion, this great controversy between Christ and Satan, this argument that happens in the council of God, when the devil is given permission to afflict Job, he employs two things: wicked humanity, and he employs the weather. The Bible says a storm came, a wind just blew over, killed all his children, destroyed all his cattle, etc., etc. And so what we learn from the story of Job is that it is true that the devil, as well as God, can employ elements of nature for the purpose of destruction. The devil can only do it with God's permission. God does it as a means of judgment and condemnation. Now, in terms of these natural disasters that take place, like let's say you were in a hurricane or in a tornado and these people die, how do we account for this kind of evil? There's two things that the Bible speaks to on this. Number one, there is an element of the fact that God judges all men according to the light that they have. So oftentimes the question of natural evil is, what happens to these people? Did they get a chance to hear the gospel and get to know Jesus? And the Bible essentially argues that no one is lost because of what they don't know. No one is lost because of what they don't do. People are lost because they don't do what they know. And so based on that individual's understanding of truth and the heart posture that they had towards that truth, God will either save them, and that will only be by the blood of Christ. Equally the same. The second point that the Bible responds is in Romans 8. It says that because man sinned in the Garden of Eden, and he was given dominion over the earth, there are many conclusions we can draw from this, but essentially the earth was cursed because of man. And when he gave over this dominion to Satan, Satan has a right to use it because man delivered it unto him according to his own will. And so the book of Romans says that the whole creation groans and travails in pain, waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. And so that the earth will be returned to its original glory and purpose when humanity, who are designed and created to inhabit it, have returned to their original state and purpose of character. And so in essence, the Bible argues that sometimes the violence of the earth is responding to the wickedness and iniquity that is performed upon it. And that the sinfulness, the earth responds to the wickedness of men as a response. But the first one deals with the redemption component to that. Where do these people go? Do they go to heaven or hell? And the second one explains the theological basis for why the earth is even in turmoil at all. That it's not just humanity, but it is also creation that has fallen from God's original purpose. That's a good question. Yes?
But on that same note, if you look at the things that we consider natural disasters, they're simply changes that the earth is undergoing. It's not necessarily something that's inherently good or bad. It just is, and it's negatively impacting us, and so we consider it bad. True.
Yeah, I understand what you mean by the egocentric perspective that, well, because people are dying, therefore earthquakes are bad or whatever. But the idea of natural evil is not so much of just a moral where there's a will being employed. That's why people usually don't raise natural evil as an objection to God. But evil, it does fall into the category of evil as that which we discussed on, I think it was Monday or Tuesday, that evil is that which ought not to be. And so there ought not to be tornadoes destroying and ravaging through lands where people are sleeping. There ought not to be earthquakes that the earth just splits up and causes tsunamis to wipe out whole border towns and whatever the case may be. Especially if God tells Adam, hey, be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. So if he's expecting him to inhabit all the physical land, how can he allow stones to be coming? So we see that God did not create the world to have violent storms and tornadoes and earthquakes, but that this is a response to the immorality of humanity. And that's where it would fall into evil, is this is that which ought not to be. And that's where we get into that. So it is true, it can appear to be very egocentric, and therefore we give it moral judgment because it happens to us. But theologically, within the Christian worldview, it is still evil in the sense that it ought not to happen. It ought not to take place. And it was never intended to be this way. An enemy has done this, is the way that Christ describes in the parable of the weeds and the tares. Good question. Yes?
Going back to Pascal's conclusion, how can we say that, like, the reason to believe is that when you're trying to get out of the lion's den, that is like towards the Christian God, can you say, oh, it could be faith also in like Allah or in a different religion? Doesn't have to.
I see. Yes. So you may agree that there's a theistic exit, right? That there is a God, there's something transcendent that can give you a way out. Why does it have to be the Christian God, right? There's a couple answers to that. First of all, we still come back to the definition of truth as that which corresponds to reality. And meaning this is that which religious worldview corresponds most to existentially how we engage and interact in the world. When you take Buddhism, for example, the assumption and the approach is, why is it that we have suffering and pain? It's because we have desires. And therefore, Buddha says the reason why you suffer is because you have desire. Therefore, the quest of life, nirvana, is complete emptiness, impersonality, when I have no desire for anything at all. Therefore, I have reached nirvana. And I will no longer suffer. The question is, does that correspond to reality? So your desire for your husband, or for your wife, or to love your child, like Buddha says, that's wrong. You shouldn't have that desire. And that's why we suffer in life, and that's the only thing preventing us from reaching nirvana, is loving my son. I mean, that is completely existentially untenable. We cannot accept that. When you go to Islam or to Hinduism, we essentially boil it down in two ways. Number one, the ultimate reality of the world functions through relationship. We say the ultimate reality is the Trinity. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in complete unity and relationship. A unity in diversity. That there's individuality, but there's community. At the very pinnacle of existence, and that which has designed all existence to be this way. So when you look at ecosystem, the environment, our desire for love and relationships, animals and how they commune and hunt and do all these different things, this looks like a work of a being that is in relationship, not the result of a being that is impersonal, exists on its own, have no regard or desire for anything else. Secondly, we also approach the fact that every religion in the world outside of Christianity teaches that there is something that I can do to remove myself from the human situation or the human predicament. And that is the fact that there's evil in my own heart. That is innate, untaught to me. And that there's a natural bend of my heart. And so Christ's description of the human condition seems to correspond best with reality. That's why we say we believe this one is truth. Versus, yeah, you could argue these other things, but the whole system of belief does not necessarily correspond to reality. Reincarnation, the concept of rebirth, Islam, Allah created the world with jinn, wicked spirits, in order to test us. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we're like, that is untenable, but it all boils down to, can you save yourself by your own works, or do you need a power outside of yourself? And Christianity is the only one that says man can do nothing to save himself. And that one seems to correspond best to reality. So that's how we determine the Christian view as being supreme or best, in that it corresponds best to reality. That's the intent. So, yes, you guys are alive today.
What would you say to someone who doesn't want to have eternal life? He says heaven would be very boring. I'd rather just die. At the end of my life. Okay, I live a good life. I really don't want to live another one. What do you say to that?
So what would I say to a person who says they don't want eternal life, they consider heaven to be very boring? There's a couple things that I can say, which is, number one, I would seek to establish for that individual the difference that, again, of David Hume. You cannot predict an infinite number or amount or quantity or quality based on a finite quality or quantity. That person is looking at eternal life in the terms of life right now. That's the only way they can understand life. And the Bible says that, look, eyes have not seen, ears have not heard, neither has entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for them that love him. So it is beyond his wildest imagination. And the fact that he cannot imagine how heaven can be pleasurable does not mean heaven will not be pleasurable. Secondly, there seems to be an issue of value. And the issue of meaning clearly comes up in that situation. And therefore, I oftentimes confront people with the fact that when there's a feeling of emptiness, a lack of meaning in life, we provide those four basic things that Solomon talks about in Ecclesiastes. The issue of wonder, the issue of the issue of truth and justice, the issue of love and relationships, and the issue of eternity. The fact that there's something in us that wants to go beyond death. When we are approaching death. Maybe in our youth we feel death is very far away, but when death is very near, we have a completely different response. And so those things, the issue of wonder, and as we talked about the laughter of that little child, and that heaven is essentially that place where we continually experience the laughter that little children experience as they experience in this world, is what we shall experience in the world to come. So that would be what I would say. Yes, last question.
It's just a thought. I was just thinking about the whole issue of evil, because a lot of points about evil came up.
Mm-hmm.
I think the question becomes, what is evil? Like, can atheism or Christianity account for the knowledge of evil?
Of course, yes.
Worldviews, account for the knowledge of evil. But the other thing is, so we're talking about proving to someone that God exists, or that there is room for faith and all these things.
Proving to someone that God exists?
Yeah, like, there's room for faith.
Yeah, there's room for faith. There's a rational reason. There's evidence.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I was just thinking, the Bible says, the beginning of the wisdom or knowledge is, that fear of the knowledge or wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And is there any way that we can use that statement, apologetics, to actually, because, we cannot really prove, to be honest, as Christians, we cannot prove the existence of God.
Absolutely.
Because it's impossible.
Well, if it was proved, there is no room for faith. You don't need faith.
There's no room for faith. And
Correct.
unless we start assuming that God exists or accepting that God exists, we cannot even take any other knowledge, even as Christians. So is there any place or room for that?
The fear of God as the beginning of wisdom.
Yeah, and in Romans it says that the knowledge of God is in every created being.
Right.
Is there any room that we can use that in our apologies? Because especially in a university setting like this, it all becomes about fossils or about proving this and that. But ultimately, to be honest, we cannot prove that God exists.
Correct. No. We definitely cannot prove that God exists, and we should never seek to do that. We fall into the same trap as the atheist worldview. We're going to arrive at some sort of self-defeating argument or contradiction if we try to go that route. I can prove that God exists. And the very test of knowledge, because really what you're grappling with is epistemology, the theory of knowledge. How do we know anything? So people say, how do you know God exists? My question is, how do you know anything at all? Well, how do you know that that's your mom? How do you know that's your phone number? Well, someone showed it to me. So the idea of how do we know anything, epistemology is really what people are grappling with in terms of the existence of God. Now, in terms of using certain things as an apologetic, the concept of an apologetic is contextual. Meaning this, there was someone, that Christians were boasting all these things down south in the Bible Belt. Jesus is the answer, Jesus is the answer, Jesus is the answer. And then atheists posted a comment in their own poster and they said, what is the question? You keep talking about Jesus is the answer. What is the question? And obviously they're doing this, pejoratively and in anger and frustration, but it's because, as you said, there's certain things we assume. So as an apologetic, whenever we want to engage in apologetics, we must keep in mind that it has to have context. So the fear of God is the beginning of knowledge, Proverbs 9 verse 10 in the book of Job as well, that this has to have a specific context in which Solomon is speaking in the book of Proverbs. And so context for apologetics is critical. Could you use it? Absolutely. But I would say, what context would you be able to use the fear of God as the beginning of knowledge or wisdom? Well, first of all, you establish the idea that if there is such a being as God, let's just say it is possible, which every human being has to posit that possibility. It is possible that such a being exists. And I believe what could be extracted from this verse apologetically is the fact that if there is such a being that does exist, would you not need to have a sense of reverence and awe in how you approach the subject about him? That is what I believe Solomon is trying to grapple with there, and that's how it could be used apologetically. This is the same thing that whenever you engage with a Muslim, Muslims oftentimes are hard to engage in because of that very issue of fear and reverence. We'll go and say, well, how do you know Muhammad? And we'll just say his name flippantly. Versus for a Muslim, anytime you say the name Muhammad, you must say, peace be upon him. You can't just throw his name out there and be like, oh yeah, Muhammad this, Muhammad that. They're like, whoa. You're offending me by your very language and introduction of your comments. So as a result of that, contextually, the fear and the reverence of such a being, if he were to exist, which God tends to be the name Elohim employed for the application of his sovereignty to all of creation in existence. Contextually, you could argue that if he does exist, we must have a sense of reverence and awe in how we approach him. But if that context is not established, nothing can serve as an apology. And I think that is what a lot of people are engaging in apologetics that is very meaningless, or it's ivory towers. We're just speaking to each other. Oh, this is really cool apologetic. Look, I found this, and we can use this reasoning. But whenever you're giving an apologetic, you must have three criteria. It has to be logically consistent. That means it makes sense and it corresponds to the laws of logic. It must be empirically adequate, which means you have adequate evidence to substantiate the claims that you're making. And thirdly, existentially relevant. It has to apply at the dinner table. It can't just apply in a university hall somewhere, or in some little philosophical debate in your classroom. But when you're sitting down with your uncle, and he's saying, look, you tell me God exists, then how come my wife died with cancer? You're not going to sit there and tell them, well, Uncle Bud, evil is that which ought not to be. Your brother's going to start looking at you like, listen, man, I lost my wife. You're playing international gymnastics in semantics. We're talking about the loss of his best friend. And so therefore, apologetics must be applied contextually. And it must follow those three criteria. Yes, logically consistent, which we tend to be obsessive with. Empirical adequacy we tend to neglect. Where do we find the evidence to support the claims that we are making? In life. And existential relevance. Does it apply on the everyday experience, every experiential level? How we live life. Is that how you actually live? And I end with this remark, is that there was a woman who was an atheist, and her friend was like, hey, this guy's coming to speak, and I think he can help answer all of the questions that you've been asking me at work. And she was delighted to come. She said, I'm excited, it looks interesting. She rode with him to the event, and as they arrived at the event, she sat through the whole thing, and as they were driving home, he was asking, what did you think? And she says, no, it was very good. But I wondered how he is in his private life. That's what her mind was going. What you're saying makes sense. But my question is that how you actually live your life? And that's where apologetics can become disconnected. It's just purely for the mind. And we lose people because apologetics brings no one to Jesus. It leads no one to not leave Christianity. You can't argue someone to stay in the church when someone has offended them or slept with their wife, claiming to be a pastor of the church. What apologetic are you going to tell them? Where will you go? Do you believe that we came from monkeys? That's not going to keep them in the church. And so as a result of that, we have to deal with the intellectual, but make sure it ties in to the existential. And that speaks to people's everyday life and experience. So that we don't just turn into philosophers on the Areopagus. We will hear this matter tomorrow. Right?